Hey everybody, welcome to a follow-up episode of Pizza Legends. Today we're going to fix some things that have been requested in the project and also do some refactoring that just help give the project a whole better quality of life going forward. As always, you can download everything I'm doing here in the description below. Let's get started. So here I am in the latest version of Pizza Legends. I'll say new game here and I can walk around the world. I've gone ahead and added some content to the game, so it may look a little bit different than it did in previous videos. That's okay, we'll talk about that soon. But here, so check this out. So this character over here has a behavior loop going, but there's a weird thing in Pizza Legends right now, and it's been pointed out to me a bunch of times, and we're gonna fix it today. But if I talk to this person, this cutscene fires, but then this person over here stopped their behavior loop. And so that's kind of funny. We're going to patch the game today, and this is one of the things we're going to fix. So before we fix that problem, we need to address this deeper underlying issue. So I am in OverworldMap.js, and in this file, there's this bit here where window.overworldmaps is created. That's our window level object of all the maps in our game. Now, since the previous Pizza Legends video, I've updated this a lot. I've added a lot of content, a lot of different maps. There's like 5 or 6 of them in here. If you want to go ahead and just download exactly what I have here, that's available in the description below. Just download the project and grab this one file. But if you want to keep your current content that you have, that's totally fine. Just follow along with what I'm going to do here. So the root problem that we're going to fix here is that when the map is defined, a single instance of each game object is sort of baked into it. You see how it says new person here? It means when this is defined for the very first time when the game starts, exactly one person instance is created, and that's sort of baked into the map. So whenever we change the person or it updates itself, it's actually kind of changing the map itself. That can lead to some weird mutation bugs over time, and it's generally not a practice I like to follow. I did it this way in the first few videos just to keep things simple, but that didn't age well. Now we're going to fix it. So instead of calling new person every single time here, I'm going to back this out and just make it look like a regular JavaScript object. So just like hero. And then within that object, I'm going to add a new property called type. And type will match up with that class name. So type person, just like this. So we're going to change the structure a bit to nest all of our data inside this GameObjects config key. And that's going to look a lot like what it already looks like in GameObjects. But the difference is that it's just static data. We'll still have just a regular GameObjects object where when a map starts, we're going to dynamically create those new person classes again, those instances, and then have them live inside this bucket here. But for just static configuring the map, we don't want any like JavaScript involved. It's just static data. And so that's going to be GameObjectConfig. And so we need to make this change on every single game object in our configuration here. So I'll do the same thing here. Type person, go down here and clean it up. And so we need to make that change on every single instance of new person that we have, and then also the same for new pizza stone. So if I search the file, if you have any new pizza stones in here, we want to do the same thing where it's going to be type pizza stone, just like that. And then we'll remove the new part. So it looks just like this. I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera for everything in this file. You should do the same, and then we'll meet back here. Okay, and we're back. So at this point, our maps should all be using this config objects key. I did just change the name of that, so sorry about that little edit. But this is all static data. Each game object should have a type on it, and no instances of like new person should be called. Also, quick clarification on something I just said that may be confusing. It's okay to use JavaScript to get the data. Like this will evaluate to a number, and so that's fine. We just can't have any like instances of the class be the value here. Ideally, we wouldn't be doing any of this content stuff by hand. It would all be managed by a game editor. And so by refactoring this to just use data instead of JavaScript classes, we've opened the door to write an editor program that can just pipe this data into the game. So if I boot up the game here and say new game, you should see that nothing works because we basically just ripped out a bunch of stuff and now we need to edit the code to be ready for that new kind of content. If you pop open your console, you should see errors of things being like undefined or null, or it can no longer find what it's looking for. Quick tip, we can actually remove the title screen temporarily. So every time we reload the page, we don't have to click through this thing. So let's do that now. If I go to overworld.js and find where it creates the title screen, new title screen, we can just comment this line out and say const use save file is false, just to hard code that. Now when we boot up the game, it'll skip the title screen stuff and we can just work faster that way. Next, I'm going to come up to OverworldMap in the class. And in the constructor here, we currently have this.gameObjects equals whatever config gameObjects are passed in. And now we just renamed that, but we do want to keep this key around. And so what I'm going to do here is just change it to be an empty object. This object is going to continue to be where our instances of game objects live, but we're going to boot it up fresh every single time. And so it's going to start empty. When the map mounts, we're going to fill it with those instances. And then if we leave the map and come back, we're going to do that again with fresh instances. This is slightly different than what we had before, where the same instances were used whether we leave and come back. And that's where some of those mutation bugs can happen. Now we can read all that content data we wrote by bringing in this line here. So this.configObjects equals whatever is on config.configObjects. That naming is kind of funny, but whatever. So this is where the live objects live. Also funny naming. Live objects are in here. And then this is where the configuration happens. So now let's modify our mounting code to look at the configuration objects instead of the game objects, which is empty, of course, right now. So let's go to mount objects, our method in OverworldMap here. And we're going to make some changes. So currently it's iterating through game objects, but we can change this to be config objects. You can do multi-cursors, by the way. I don't know if we've covered this, but if you highlight something and then hit Command D on Mac or Control D on Windows, it'll select the same thing. So you can edit both at the same time, which is kind of sweet. So now we're iterating through our config objects. I'm going to remove the mounting part real quick. So here, let's add some code for actually creating our game object instance. So I'm going to say let instance, I'm just going to start blank. If the object that we're iterating through, the config for it has that type of person, like we added before, instance can be a new person, and then new person, and then we'll pass in that object config. We have another case just like that for pizza stones. If you have more game objects that you've created in your game, you can add similar code like this or clean this up however you want. This will be fine for us today. Now we've created the instance and we want to actually add it to that game objects object. So we'll say this.gameObjects at position key. We can use the same key as the IDE that we're using. Will be the instance. And we'll do the same thing that kind of happened before. It's a little messy, but we'll tack on an IDE just to make sure that we have an IDE. And now we can run the same mounting code. So let's say .mount, we pass in this, and we can get rid of our comment here. So this should mount our game instance to the scene, just like it did before. So now when I boot up the game, you can see that everything looks like it's working as expected. All of these objects are coming from that content data, the configuration data, instead of instances that are baked into the actual map. So that's great. If you remember, every time a character walks around, they actually create a wall for themselves and then move that wall to wherever they're going. That's how these collisions work, where this character won't notice step on me. But by doing it in that way, we sort of violate that policy of never wanting to mutate the map object because it's actually changing the walls within the map. So we're going to modify our collision detection code to just check where people are now instead of actually doing the overhead of creating a wall for them and moving those walls around. So back in OverworldMap, I found this section where our 3 wall methods are, add wall, remove wall, and move wall. We're going to just delete them all. Because again, once a wall comes in via configuration, the walls list is never going to change. Now we need to remove those usages of the methods because we just removed them. So I'll go ahead and search the whole project for .move and look for .move wall. So there's one. I'll do the same thing for add wall. Here's one here. Here's another one. And then here's a remove wall. So now the walls are never changing. Now when I run the game, characters can just walk through each other because there's no wall checking or anything. It's just totally fine for them to walk through. If you like that style for your game, you could totally keep it that way. But we're going to go ahead and put that collision detection back in. So I'm in OverworldMap again, and I found the isSpaceTaken method. And right now it's only looking for walls that exist on the map, but we've just removed all the people ones. So now we're going to augment this to also check where people are right now. So this first check can stay the same, sort of. So first we're just going to check for a wall at this position. Those are the walls that are baked into the map and never change. If you find one there, just return true. That space is taken. Now we're going to check for game objects at this position. And so I'll bring in some code here where we're just going to iterate through our game objects like we've done before. And I'm going to use find because we're looking for a first match with a certain condition. And so now we're going to check a few conditions here. The first one I'm going to bring in here, and it just says, if object.x is x and object.y is y, then go ahead and return true. And if it's not true, we can return false. I'll show you why we did it this way in a second. This is basically not quite good enough. Let's see why. When I boot up the game with just that check alone, the initial bit of it kind of works, where if they try to walk to somewhere where I am, it won't let them. But there's also this weird thing where if they're in transit, I can kind of walk through them. And what's happening there is that we're only checking their current position. So if that's changing and that's not an exact match, that's not quite good enough. And it feels kind of flaky. I don't really like how it feels. One of the benefits of that move wall approach that we had before was that when a character was about to move, they'd place a wall where they were going. And so that would kind of reserve it for them. And so we need to add a little bit of a system that sort of achieves that same effect. So we're going to do this a little bit backwards. But in our check here, let's go ahead and add the code that will check an intent. An intent doesn't exist yet, but we're going to add it. So it's going to look something like if object.intent, like I intend to move there, that's either going to be null, like it doesn't exist, or it's going to be an array of x and y. So I'm going to beef it up a little bit and call it intent position. So if you have one and intent position 0 is x, and we'll do the same for y. So number 1 is y. You could also return true here. Now let's create this so it exists on a person. So we'll go up to person. In the constructor, right after this dot is standing, we'll do the same thing. So this dot intent position, it's going to start as null, and it's going to be null unless we have a value for it. So I'll just add a comment. It's either null or it's going to look like x, y. Now let's find the bit of the code where we're ready to walk and we start moving. That's when moving progress remaining is set to 16, and it'll downtick from there. I'm going to bring in some code here that just uses some of our helpers. So we have this util next position that's going to take in our current x, our current y, and the direction we're facing and give us that next position that we're going to go to. And then I'm just going to set our this.intent position to an array. First is x and then y. Let's say intent here. And now we're setting a value whenever we're about to start walking. Now, once we get there, we're going to go ahead and clean up that intent position and remove it. So when we'll find the code that happens when you finish walking, that's when your moving progress hits 0, we're going to go ahead and just clear out our intent. Now when I run the game, the detection feels just like it did before, where I can't really overlap with people because people are reserving where they want to go. Yet we've done it in a way that doesn't actually change the map itself. And just a quick note here that we are now iterating through all the game objects when we're checking for a space detection. So it is technically a little bit slower, but if we're dealing with just such a small amount of game objects, like, the handful that we are, it's really no big deal. You'd probably only hit issues with this if you really scale to tons of game objects, where then you'd have to bring in some performance optimizations. So with these changes in place, we're now in a much better spot to actually fix the thing that we're here to fix. And that thing is that when I talk to this NPC, other NPCs stop their idle behavior loops. See how he stopped here. So now let's go ahead and add in the part where after a cutscene ends, he's going to restart his behavior. So I'm back in GameObject.js. There's a comment here about NPCs not restarting their thing, which was intentional at the time, but now we're going to change that. At the bottom of the constructor, I'm going to add a new field. So this dot retry timeout. And it can just start null. So let's find the doBehaviorEvent method. Here it is. And this is called, when a map starts, this is what starts the characters doing their loops. And right now they're set to stop when a cutscene starts. And that makes sense because we don't want anything to mess with the cutscene. But if that's true, it'll just return early and then never call itself again. And we can keep this sort of in place, but we want to kind of expand on this first check if the cutscene is playing. So below that, I'm going to move it to its own check. So if map.isCutscene playing, we can return right here to stop the code, just like the case before did. But right before we stop it, we're going to set up a timeout to try again later. It's kind of like what the characters do when they're waiting for someone to move out of their way when walking. So I'll say this.retry timeout is equal to a new set timeout. and we give our callback function. I'm going to put like a second here. You can tweak this to be whatever you want. But the idea is, we don't want it firing all the time, just like enough breathing room. And so here, we're just going to try to call this function again. And we're going to pass through that same map that came before. So if this is called with a map, we're going to pass through that same map instance. But now before we set this timeout, we want to make sure we clear it if we have one. So we'll just check if retry timeout has a value, then we're going to clear the timeout. This.retry timeout. So that'll kind of replace it with this new one coming in. Say they stacked up, like if cutscenes are happening really quickly or something, and there was already a queued one to retry, we're just going to clear that retry and replace it with this one. Back in the game, this person is walking around doing his idle behavior. Everything's fine. If I talk to this person here, a cutscene starts. They don't want to talk to me. And as soon as I resolve this cutscene, this person is going to go back to doing what they were doing before. So that retry has happened, and now they're doing their thing. And I can go leave the map, walk through this map, come back to this map, and he's still doing his thing. So now that we're dealing with fresh instances on every map load, we need to deal with cleaning up a little bit. So if you remember in GameObject.js, we have this flag called isMounted. And this is set to true when an object enters the scene. Now we want to set it to false when we move away from the map that the object's in. So I'm going to find our overworld event where we change the map. And here it is. And so right before we do anything, we want to deactivate all of the objects. So now I'm going to bring in another loop, just like we've seen before, where we're going to iterate through all the game objects. And then for each one, we're going to grab that flag and set it to false. So this is like deactivate old objects. And say you wanted to build a feature where characters could like leave the scene at any time. Maybe they disappear at a certain point. You could use this kind of thing for that also. So now if we're a person and we find the code that wants to start the behavior, we'll say we're not activated. So if this.isMounted is false, we just want to stop here. We have some timeouts and things that are periodically trying to call this. And so if we're not supposed to do anything anymore, we just want to stop. And so we can add this check right here. And now we can also go over to our game object, and in the code that wants to do behavior events, we can remove this check for isStanding and remove the comments too. So now when I boot up the game, notice this character that's walking around here starts in the top left of his cycle. So if I leave the room, even though he was just in the bottom part of the cycle there, but if I come back, he's always going to start in that same configured position. Same with these people too. They're going to always do the same thing in the room. So now our instances are nice and fresh. And let's check our pizza stone too. So I've navigated north in the map. If you explore the code download, you can get to this point. And I'll interact with this pizza stone, and it still works as expected. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit like and subscribe if you like these videos. That really helps me out. And I hope you join us in Discord. If you're working on a game or have an idea for a game and you want some help or some people to bounce ideas off of, we got a great community of people that are building games. Game Dev Shift Discord. It's linked in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.